So welcome everybody. This is going to be our first ECogS seminar talk. We have Tony Chemero here. He's an expert, a well-known expert on ecological psychology. He's going to surprise us with something. I told him about the background and the projects that we have in this unit. So he thought of what would be better to speak to us. And yeah, so I'm very happy that he accepted to give this talk. Soon I'm going to send the calendar with the few sessions that we have programmed. Many of the speakers have already accepted the invitation. So we're going to have a better notice and a bit more knowledge before this happens. Yeah, so we're very happy to have Tony here and welcome.
Thank you. Should I start?
Yes, please.
Okay. Sharing my screen. Is that shared?
Yes.
Good. So hi, everyone. Thank you, Laura, for organizing. I'm glad to have seen your photograph because I wouldn't have recognized you with your mask. It's good to see you. And I guess thank you, Tom, for organizing all of this. And I want to start with a kind of two-part apology. First is that I've recently moved to a new house. And I haven't really found a spot in my new house where I get good Wi-Fi reception and good sound isolation. And the second part of the apology is that given the time of day, there's lots of stuff going on at my house. So you might hear dogs barking and children and people moving around and stuff. So I apologize for that. Also, it's a very different time of day here, so cheers. Okay, so this is what I decided to talk about. Basically, when I asked Laura what I should talk about, I was hoping just not to give a talk that lots of people in the audience have seen already. That was my main goal. And this is a brand new one, so I figured this will work. So let me start. I was asked recently to give a talk at the International Conference on Spatial Cognition. Which I don't know much about, but it was in Rome, and I thought, hell, the pandemic will be over by then, and I'll get a trip to Rome out of this. So I started reading the kind of classic papers in spatial perception and spatial cognition, and this, okay. And right in the title, there's the development of spatial representations of large-scale environments. This is one of the most cited papers in the spatial cognition literature. And here's from the 1999 MIT Encyclopedia of Cognitive Sciences. This is an entry by Carol Colby on spatial perception. She says, spatial perception is the faculty that allows us to do so, that is to localize ourselves in space. Sensory and motor information are used together to construct an internal representation of the space we perceive. The nature of this representation and the neural mechanisms underlying it have become a topic of great interest in cognitive neuroscience. And in fact, at this meeting, I don't know if any of you here attended it, most of the talks were about the representation of space and cognition about space and reasoning about space, which is really not kind of what interests me. So here's the idea is that if you think about a person representing space. So here's a person who is trying to decide which way to go. And here you can imagine is something like what they're representing, some possible headings, 280 degrees, then turn 80 degrees, or just go 350 degrees, or just go 0 degrees. Then they have to go through some criteria for deciding which of these are better to which of these routes is the best one to take. And the fact is that, this is how people typically do work in spatial cognition. How is this person representing the space? And how are they using that representation to decide how to orient themselves and move through the space? But that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in inhabiting space. So being in a space. So those headings are where this woman could have walked in this museum scene. But instead of understanding her as building an internal representation of the environment and working on that, I want to think about her as being in the space. And this is from Merleau-Ponty. We must not say that our body is in space, nor for that matter in time. It inhabits space and time. And this is a very different understanding of what's going on when we perceive and think about things in space than you get in the kind of typical spatial cognition article or talk. And one of the reasons that you don't get much Merleau-Ponty in this body of research is that people are trained to do cognitive science. And a phenomenological approach like Merleau-Ponty doesn't seem necessarily amenable to a scientific approach to cognition. So that's the question. Can there be a science of inhabiting space? And that's what I'm going to try to answer today. And I'm sorry about that little quotation mark. I thought I deleted that right before I got online. So can I talk about, is it possible to have a science of inhabiting space? But first, I'm going to say a few things about what Merleau-Ponty means when he says that we inhabit space, we don't represent it. We're not in it in the same way that a ball would be in a cup, say. So Merleau-Ponty discusses this in terms of what he calls the lived body. And this is the central claim, really, of his book, The Phenomenology of Perception, is that what we are bodies. We are living bodies. We perceive with our bodies. We are conscious with our bodies. And when we talk about bodies, we're actually talking about a lived body. And a lived body, he contrasts this with a Körper, which is a physical body. The lived body is the locus of a first-person experience. And he says, I can only understand the function of the living body by accomplishing it, and to the extent that I am a body that rises up to the world. So that's the basic idea of the lived body. And after many pages of discussing the lived body, Merleau-Ponty discusses what he calls the body schema. So the idea is our lived body, which is a set of skills and habits and so on, is what makes the world. It opens up the world to us as a place we can act. And when we have the world opened up to us by our skills and abilities and habits and tendencies and desires, we don't think about the possibilities. We just are open to them. They are there for us. This is what the phenomenological approach is saying. And what Merleau-Ponty calls the body schema is basically our readiness to deploy our skills and habits and abilities in order to accomplish goals. So it's this, we're always ready to act, right? And that is what our body schema does for us. And that's what makes the world intelligible to us. And it's what makes it possible for us to be in the world with things. Now, when Merleau-Ponty discusses the body schema, he talks about an understanding of space. And he says, far from my body being for me merely a fragment of space, there would be for me no such thing as space if I did not have a body. The body schema is, in the end, a manner of expressing that my body is in and towards the world. Right, so these are quotes from Merleau-Ponty talking about how it is that our lived bodies, which is our set of abilities and skills and habits and tendencies, how that makes us have a world at all. And it makes it so that our world is not something that we are a mere other object in. Right? We inhabit the world. We're not a thing in it. So I just said this. We must say that, and I had that quote earlier, the lived body does not occur in space like a thing does. It has its own kind of spatiality. And this is this idea of inhabiting. So again, the idea is that we have an intentional relationship, intentional in the philosopher's sense of being aimed at. We are aimed at the world. We are pointed at the world. The world is there for us, but we are not there. We're not aimed at the world. We don't have intentionality by thinking. Instead, we have motor intentionality. That is the aiming at actions, aiming at things that we can do. And again, this is what our lived body does via the body schema. Okay, so that was a really fast run through of some of Merleau-Ponty's ideas on the lived body. And I felt like I could go fairly quickly through them because I suspect that many of you already have been exposed to this. So here's I'm going to switch to a different part of the talk now. So the world, in as much as it harbors living beings, ceases to be a material plenum consisting of juxtaposed parts. It opens up as the place where behavior appears. And this is actually Merleau-Ponty's From the Structure of Behavior. So an earlier work than the Phenomenology of Perception, but similar phrases appear in that book. And I want to show you this quote right next to it. This is from James Gibson, The Ecological Approach to Visual Perception. He says, the world of physical reality does not consist of meaningful things. The world of ecological reality, as I've been trying to describe it, does. If what we perceive are the entities of physics and mathematics, meanings would have to be imposed upon them. If what we perceive are the entities of ecological sciences, their meanings can be discovered. So what Gibson is saying here, in many more words, is that the world, the ecological world, the world that we live in, is the space where we act, right? So they're saying really quite similar things. And why this is unsurprising is that James Gibson taught a seminar on Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception around 1970. Also, and this is, lore that will soon be lost because the people who studied directly with Gibson are getting older. But if you said you wanted to study with Gibson in his lab, he would often hand you a copy of the Phenomenology of Perception and say, figure this out first and then come back, because that's what we do. So even though Gibson himself kind of downplayed the importance of the phenomenologists in his own research, he actually was very influenced by Merleau-Ponty when he wrote his final book. And it's hard to read here, but in the image on the right, that's actually a place where Gibson is taking notes on Merleau-Ponty's description of the perception of space, of three-dimensionality, depth perception. And if you look at what Gibson writes, first it's a brilliant description, but then he's down below it, actually, instead of writing down what Merleau-Ponty says on page 255 in the 1962 translation, Gibson writes down his own theory, what eventually becomes his own theory of depth perception, right? So again, this is a strong indicator of an influence here. So, what I'm doing now is I'm making the transition, like, could there be a science of inhabiting space? Well, because Gibson himself was primarily a psychologist, then I'm going to argue that there can be, and I'll give you a couple examples of it. And okay, so Gibson is most well known for his theory of affordances, and affordances are opportunities for action. They are directly meaningful for animal, and in fact, they are what constitutes the world that the animal inhabits. And we don't think about affordances. We don't start with sensations and then construct the affordances in our brain. We perceive them directly, Gibson said. So affordances are resources, and they're a resource that the environment offers any animal with the correct capabilities to perceive and use it. Let me just say that in Merleau-Ponty's terms. An affordance is a resource that the environment offers any animal that has the capabilities to perceive and use it. That is, it offers these affordances to any animal with the right lived body, that is, right lived body and body schema, right? So again, this is Gibson saying something very similar to Merleau-Ponty. And here's Gibson's famous quote, which I often use as a way to say, wow, Gibson is really confused about affordances. But in fact, if you understand it in terms of saying something like the world is the place where behavior appears, as Merleau-Ponty says, it actually makes perfect sense, because the place where behavior appears is neither objective nor subjective, or maybe it's both. It doesn't really matter. It's the place where behavior appears is part of the world, but it's also about me, right? And Gibson says it's both physical and psychical, yet neither. And affordance points both ways to the environment and the observer. That means that to understand the affordances in the environment, you have to understand the agent. You have to understand what the agent is like. So that is the thing that inhabits that environment. It's going to determine what the affordances of the environment are. Because, you know, the same physical location will afford different things to different animals. So for example, you know, I can eat spicy food and, you know, drink wine, whereas an infant can't do that. Right. And, you know, I can climb stairs, whereas an infant can't do that. So even though they were the same species at different developmental stage, the world will afford different things to us. And the world will also afford different things to me and to my dog. Right. So again, you can't understand the affordances of the world except in terms of the creature that's inhabiting that world. So what Gibson would say, put this by saying that an animal and its environment are mutual. They're mutual. They are defined in terms of one another. So my lived body, what I can do, implies a set of affordances available to me and the ones that I perceive. Right. Similarly, if you were to take out a set of affordances, it would imply a particular agent. And one time, many years ago, Michael Turvey, a famous Gibsonian psychologist, told me that he expects that someday the study of affordances will replace personality psychology. Because the idea is that if you pick out a set of affordances with the right grain of specificity, you will actually have picked out not just a type of person, but an individual person. Right? So, I mean, this is a fairly strong claim, but the idea is that the agent and its affordances, the animal and its affordances are mutual. And similarly, Gibson says that proprioception, perception of the self, and exteroception, perception of the world, are inseparable. They're one and the same thing. Right? When you perceive affordances, you're perceiving both the world is like and what you can do. So again, we perceive the world around us as scaled to our abilities. That's how we inhabit it. Sorry. So again, what I'm trying to emphasize here is the ways in which James Gibson's ecological approach to visual perception is similar to Merleau-Ponty's ideas from the phenomenology of perception. And I'm also trying to emphasize that that's not an accident. So now it's another transition. I want to talk about work by Brett Fagan and Bill Warren. And this diagram on the lower left is from a paper by just Warren, where he talks about his and Brett's work. Here we see an agent in an environment where basically you're trying to capture the dynamics of the agent environment changes over time based on what the agent does, which creates information for the agent, which changes what the agent does, which creates information for the agent. Can you see my pointer?
Yes.
Okay, good. Otherwise, I'm just playing around for no good reason. So yeah, so you see this kind of circular relationship. They both imply one another, right? And the idea is, so what Warren is giving us here is a model of the affordances in the environment, right? What with our modeling is affordances in this kind of model. And it's really a model of inhabiting the environment. So here is the model. Those of you who know physics will see this as a mass spring model. It's many terms, slightly complicated, but basically here's what it is. You have a goal. This term is the goal that you're headed toward. And you also have some obstacles and repellers. So basically, in English, your change in heading is a function of the attractiveness and direction to the goal and the repulsiveness and directions to obstacles. Right, so basically, it explains a way a creature moves through an environment based on what it wants and what it needs to avoid. And Warren and Fagan have shown how this can make sense of individual pursuit behavior in many kind of sports situations. So both American and regular football pursuit. They use this model and it makes really good sense of this. It also makes good sense of crowd behavior. It makes good sense of driving behavior. This has been a really valuable model, this model by Warren and Fagan. And what I want to point out is that it's a model of route selection, not route planning. right? That is, this does not say anything about anyone representing and reasoning about anything. It's about where the animal chooses to go based on the goals, its goals, which are modeled as an attractor, and the obstacles, which are modeled as repellers. It's also, because of that, a model of inhabiting space, right? Not representing it. It's a model of the animal in space. Now, in addition to the things he said about individual perception and individual experience, Merleau-Ponty, especially later in his work, got more and more interested in social interactions and intercorporeality, he called it. And I just want to point out here that he says things that seem more extreme in his later work, but they are actually similar to the things he says in the phenomenology of perception. So he says, and this is my translation, we need no longer explain how a being for itself can comprehend an other, starting from a position of absolute solitude, or how it can comprehend a pre-constituted world at the very moment that it constitutes the world. So here's the key phrase, and this is in italics in the original: the self is inherent in the world, and the world is inherent in the self. And the self is inherent in the other, as the other is inherent in the self, what Husserl calls the ineinander. The whole is silently written in an integral experience in which these incompatible facts are created. And philosophy becomes the attempt beyond the available logic and vocabulary to describe this universe of living paradoxes. So the world is in the self, and the self is in the world, and the other is in the self, and the self is in the other. This is, Husserl calls this the ineinander, which is German for in one another. And I want to point out really quickly that when I first saw this, I saw it only in French, and I didn't have an English translation, but I was very interested in this paragraph, so I decided to do my own translation. And then later I found there is an English translation, a standard English translation from the late 60s, and it actually leaves out this part. It leaves out the part about the self and the other. It just says the self is inherent in the world, and the world is inherent in the self, and deletes the rest of that sentence, which is, that's kind of not a very good translation. And from what I'm going to say going forward, that actually would obscure the most important thing, which is that Merleau-Ponty thought that we inhabited worlds with others. And this, has become part of both ecological science, ecological psychology, Gibsonian psychology, and philosophy. And here's the first real work on this by, this is 1990. It's Richard Schmidt's PhD dissertation. And what he did is he showed that the Haken-Kelso-Bunz model of interlimb coordination works just as well on pairs of people. Right, so you can take the same mathematical model that works on doing this also works on people swinging their legs together. Another philosophical version of this is by de Jager and de Paulo, participatory sense making. This is in a more Merleau-Pontian enactive tradition, not in the ecological tradition. Again, back in the ecological tradition, Mike Riley, and this is really Veronica Ramanzoni's work, Riley et al. Talked about interpersonal synergy. That is, ways in which two individuals or multiple individuals can form a unit for a short time. And here's a paper by Tom and de Paulo, and they point out that this actually makes sense at all scales. And one more, this is my favorite version of this by Drew Abney, Alex Paxton, Rick Dale, and Chris Kello, where they show how people in conversation couple with one another so strongly that they are like a single unit. And here's a paper that I wrote a few years ago, which was based primarily on the ecological side of this, the scientific side. And only later did I realize how close it was to what enactivist philosophers like de Jager, de Paulo, and Rosa were saying. So here's my point, is this being in one another has been a topic for philosophy and also a topic for science. And the last thing I want to show you is work by my former PhD student, Maurice Lamb. And they, here, I'll start the video playing. They did a 2-person pick and place task. And the idea is that the goal is to, when the square appears, to move it to a goal location. And sometimes the goal location is such that what you really have to do is pass it to the other person who can put it in the location. So this is a 2-person task. And I should point out that that's Maurice with the plaid shirt on. They both have plaid shirts, and that's Maurice. And this work has been used in both human subjects research and robotics research and human-robot interaction research. So what they did to explain this pick and place behavior, though, is they applied basically Fajan and Warren model to a 2-agent pick and place task, except for they didn't even bother with the second term, right? They only needed the attractors because basically all that's in this space, shared space, is a goal. And interestingly, they were able to use that mathematical model to drive both a virtual and a robotic agent that can do the task with people just as well as people do it with people. And here's the key point here is that this is not a model of or experiments about representing a task and another agent, right? This is 2 agents inhabiting a shared space. That's what the model is. That's what the science is about. So this is the answer to the question I asked at the beginning. Can you use a phenomenological approach and do good science of spatial perception and spatial cognition? And I want to say that the answer is yes. I showed you 2 such models, one individual model and one social model. And in fact, it's the same mathematical model. So here's a summary. If we start talking about inhabiting the world, we, instead of representing it and thinking about it, we end up doing a very different kind of science, right? And what we get from this inhabiting approach is an understanding of what it is to be in spaces, to live in them as a living body, not how you represent them. And also crucially from my point of view, this makes sense of shared spaces, right? So spaces that are inhabited by 2 individuals or multiple individuals, and they're not separate spaces as they would be if they were representations of those spaces. There is one space that these individuals share when they're working on a task together. And this is important. I think this is at the very least politically important, if it's not scientifically important, that we actually share spaces, that we share experiences, and we share a world. And lastly, phenomenological approaches are not dead ends scientifically, but we can use them to think about how to do new kinds of experiments. And I will stop there.